Amid shutdown fight, Trump is no longer distancing himself from Project 2025. Now, I'm sure that you all are aware the government is currently shut down. The official reason why the shutdown is happening right now is because it needs to pass some sort of continuing resolution or some sort of official budget on the Senate to prevent a government shutdown. So about like 6 months ago, the Senate passed an appropriations bill. Now, the appropriations process is different, right? I'm not going to get too into the technical details, but basically to pass an appropriations bill, you only need 50 votes. You only need a simple majority. But to pass an official Senate budget resolution, you need a 60 vote threshold. The reconciliation bill that they passed 6 months ago, right, was passed only with Republicans, and they squeezed in some stuff that like Democrats really, really don't like, right? They took away ACA subsidies, which I believe reduces the cost of anybody getting their health insurance through an ACA marketplace by like 100%, 120%. So basically anybody that's on ACA programs, which I think was something like 10% of all people insured in the United States, have some of those costs covered by these ACA subsidies, and which amounts to about half of the cost. So the people in these ACA programs, and the ACA is supposed to be an insurance program for people on the lower income brackets, they get their costs reduced even more. Well, the removal the Republicans already did through the reconciliation bill 6 months ago, and they're wanting to solidify now in the actual Senate budget bill, is the removal of these ACA subsidies. And the only thing that removing these ACA subsidies will do is basically a little bit over double the cost of healthcare for anybody who gets their insurance through the ACA marketplace, which, like I said, is somewhere between like 7 and 10% of all insured people in the United States. Oh yeah, and those 7 to 10% are some of the poorest people who have insurance in the United States. So basically all this does is just increase the cost of healthcare for poor people for basically like for really no reason. I mean, you can't pretend this is about budgetary reasons, because this administration has clearly shown on so many different levels that they are not fiscally conservative. They don't care about balancing the budget. This isn't about like economics or anything like that, right? So you can't possibly make that argument in good faith. So what is this about? Well, this is about just like making poor people's lives worse. Like it's just another one of those things where like you can't really come up with like a super good faith, plausible deniability argument for this, right? It's really just like bad. It's just bad for no reason. Those are the official reasons why the government is shut down right now, right? The technical official reasons. But the real reason I've heard, and I'm hoping that this article will substantiate this a little bit, is that this was essentially all part of Project 2025, right? And the guy, Russ Vought, who's kind of heading all of the shutdown stuff, was literally one of the authors of Project 2025. Well, what does it say about doing this? Well, there was a lot of backlash when they tried to cut government agencies unilaterally using Doge like 6 months ago or whatever, right? There's a lot of backlash on that. Some of it got reversed, and they weren't able to do quite as much as they hoped. Well, the plan, what I've heard basically, is that the Trump administration wanted this government shutdown. And the reason why they wanted the government shutdown is because so they can basically achieve all their Doge goals with, through sort of a loophole, right? So what happens when the government shuts down like this is that like millions and millions of government employees are put on furlough, which is basically like temporarily, you aren't getting paid, but you're not fired, right? Basically everything's on pause, and that you should get paid whenever things pick back up, and that your job will continue whenever things pick back up and everything like that. Well, the loophole that they're trying to exploit is basically like shut down the government. Everybody gets furloughed by the agency heads officially, and then they direct the agency heads, which the Supreme Court is increasingly saying the president has authority over these agency heads and these agencies in general, to shift all these furloughed employees over to expulsion or to firing them. There's a word for it. It started with R. There's like a technical word they use, but I can't remember exactly what it is. But basically they're going to, direct these agency heads to go, okay, all those furloughed employees, fire them. And doing so is just going to absolutely cripple most of these agencies, or at least the agencies that they're wanting to go after, and basically achieve their goals of undermining Congress, of cutting these Democrat government agencies that help everyday people without having to go through Congress, or President Donald Trump is openly embracing the conservative blueprint he desperately tried to distance himself from during the 2024 campaign, as one of its architects works to use the government shutdown to accelerate his goals of slashing the size of the federal workforce and punishing Democratic states. He desperately tried to distance himself from during the 2024 campaign. Anybody who thought that Trump wasn't like for or connected with or like in just ambivalent towards the Project 2025, I've got some real estate to sell you in the Sahara. In a post on his Truth Social site Thursday morning, Trump announced he would be meeting with his budget chief, Russ Vought, he of Project 2025 fame, to determine which of the many Democrat agencies, most of which are a political scam, he recommends to be cut, and whether or not those cuts will be temporary or permanent. The comments represented a dramatic about face for Trump, who spent much of the last year denouncing Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's massive proposed overhaul of the federal government, which was drafted by many of his longtime allies and current and former administration officials. Asked about Trump's reversal, White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson said, "Democrats are desperate to talk about anything aside from their decision to hurt the American people by shutting down the government." Bro, all they can do is deflect to the Democrats. It's actually kind of cringe how like every time they're asked a question about anything, they can only say the Democrats, even in scenarios where it doesn't make any damn sense at all, right? They're just relying on people not paying attention. And, you know, who are they speaking to, right? Well, they're speaking to their base who doesn't pay attention or look up anything when they say Democrats are desperate and blah, 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 blah. You know, they blame everything on the Democrats. Top Trump campaign leaders spent much of 2024 livid at the Heritage Foundation for publishing a book full of unpopular proposals that Democrats tried to pin on the campaign to warn a second Trump term would be too extreme. While many of the policies outlined in its 900-plus pages aligned closely with the agenda that Trump was proposing, particularly on curbing immigration and dismantling certain federal agencies, others called for action Trump had never discussed, like banning pornography, or Trump's team was actively trying to avoid, like withdrawing approval for abortion medication. Trump repeatedly insisted he knew nothing about the group or who was behind it, despite his close ties with many of its authors. They included John McEntee, his former director of the White House Presidential Personnel Office, and Paul Dans, former chief of staff of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. "I know nothing about Project 2025, Trump insisted in 2024. In July 2024. "I have no idea who is behind it. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. Anything they do, I wish them luck, but I have nothing to do with them." Trump's campaign chiefs were equally critical. President Trump's campaign has been very clear for over a year that Project 2025 had nothing to do with the campaign, did not speak for the campaign, and should not be associated with the campaign or the president in any way, wrote Susie Wiles and Chris LaCavita in a campaign memo. They added reports of Project 2025's demise would be greatly welcomed and should serve as notice to anyone or any group trying to misrepresent their influence with President Trump and his campaign. It will not end well for you. Trump has since gone on to stalk his second administration with its authors, including Vought, border czar Tom Homan, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, immigration hardliner Stephen Miller, and Brandon Carr, who wrote Project 2025's chapter on the Federal Communications Commission and now chairs the panel. Yeah, the whole idea that the guy who wrote the whole chapter on how they want to undermine the power of the FCC and usurp it and whatnot, in this like draconian weird Project 2025 thing they put out, right? He's literally the guy that like he's literally the head of the FCC now, right? This is beyond regulatory capture, right? Because like regulatory capture sort of implies like that these agencies are being headed by this exact companies that they're directed to oversight. And that is true. But it's kind of worse, right? It's kind of like a step up from the private regulatory capture that I just mentioned, because like it's not like Brendan Carr is shilling for AT&T or whatever, right? He's shilling for the larger ideological movement. who's against like the government functioning properly in general. So like I think it's probably, this is like regulatory capture on steroids, because it's like even worse. It's not just for the, you know, the bottom line of private companies. It's also for their weird, disgusting ideological project. Heritage did not respond to a request for comment Thursday, but Dans, the project's former director, said it's been exciting to see so much of what was laid out in the book put into action. It's gratifying. We're very proud of the work that was done for this express purpose. To have a doer like President Trump ready to roll on day one, said Dans, who is currently running for Senate against Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. Since his swearing in, Trump has been pursuing plans laid out in Project 2025 to dramatically expand presidential power and reduce the size of the federal workforce. They include efforts like the Department of Government Efficiency and budget rescission packages, which have led to billions of dollars being stalled, scrapped, or withheld by the administration so far this year. I've said this many times before, but like I hate this conservative, like this brain rot that's on the conservative side of politics right now, and reduce the size of the federal workforce, right? They're saying like reducing the size of the federal workforce or reducing the size of the government or whatever is like inherently good, right? It's the really dumb small government versus big government argument, right? And they're on the side of, well, I think small government is better and big government is bad inherently, and therefore the government doing anything is bad, basically, right? And that we should do as little with the government as possible. But like that's just really dumb when you consider like there are good things the government does, there are bad things the government does, right? And the correct amount of government is the correct amount of government, right? The correct amount of government is one that's not too big, but also one that's not too small, if I'm going to use their verbiage on this. You want a government, you want a government that works for the people and does good things and improves the country. And that might mean big or small, depending on what your definition of big or small is. But to just say like big government bad and therefore government doing stuff bad, therefore reducing the federal workforce just broadly is a good thing, doesn't make any sense. It's just pure brain rot. They are now using the shutdown to accelerate their progress. Ahead of the funding deadline, OMB directed agencies to prepare for additional mass firings of federal workers, rather than simply furloughing those who were not deemed essential, as has been the usual practice during past shutdowns. Vought told House GOP lawmakers in a private conference call Wednesday that layoffs would begin in the next day or two. That's what I'm saying, right? This was the plan from the beginning, right? They wanted this government shutdown. And also, right, like Trump himself has said, who takes, like on the campaign trail many years ago, he said, when asked who takes the blame for a government shutdown, he said it lies in the hands of the president, right? The president gets the blame for a government shutdown. So if that's his belief, then you'd think he'd be adverse to a government shutdown. Well, I think he's willing to put that aside because this was the plan all along. They wanted to cut these federal agencies, but they were unable to do so through their DOGE program, and they would be unable to do so through Congress because it would be far too unpopular to vote out much of these agencies. So the only way they can do it is through some cynical, weird loophole like this, where they just undermine the power of Congress and everything. They have also used the shutdown to target projects championed by Democrats, including canceling $8 billion in green energy projects in states with Democratic senators and withholding $18 billion for transportation projects in New York City that have been championed by Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries in their home state. The idea that like the president is going after the idea that the president is like targeting blue states or whatever is almost beyond conceivable, right? He's the president of the United States, right? All 50 of us, plus DC and Puerto Rico and all our territories or whatever, right? He's supposed to be the president of the United States, not president of the states that voted for him or that he likes the most, or president for anybody but those that he has a vendetta against, right? His duty is to the country and to the people, right? To facilitate, to improve the welfare, to facilitate the quality of life of as many Americans as possible. But like the idea, bro, and also the idea that like a Democrat would do this to Republicans, bro, they would storm the Capitol again, right? They would lose their goddamn minds. But also this is, in another way to look at this is Trump and their administration taking away your tax dollars, right? Congress is your vote, right? That is the most direct representation of the people's interest is Congress. And so when the Trump administration unilaterally says we're just going to withhold the funds that your congressperson, the people you voted for, and Congress has the power of the purse, appropriated this money to be used for these reasons, right? For the Trump administration, I don't care where or what the funding is for or where the funding is being withheld from, right? Whether it's a Democrat state or a Republican state, when it's targeted like this, it is actively taking the money out of like the pocket. You are undermining the vote and the democratic process and the governmental representation of any citizen living in a blue state that is subject to this. The moves are part of a broader effort to concentrate federal authority in the presidency, which permeated Project 2025. I wonder if the Republicans are obsessed with, and Republican strategists or whatever are obsessed with consolidating presidential power because they understand the dynamic in which it plays with the Republicans and Democrats. And what I mean by that is, like, let's say this continues on and presidential power continues to be consolidated even more and more, okay? And then 2028 comes along, or maybe even the next election, right? And we've seen even more consolidation. I think the Republican strategists know that the Democrats are a bunch of feckless pussies and are unwilling and are stuck in mud and don't understand how to play the metagame properly, right, from a game theory perspective, and that essentially they aren't going to recognize this consolidation of presidential power, right? They're going to think it's wrong. They aren't going to recognize it or whatever, and they're going to try and basically they're going to undermine themselves, right? They're going to either try and go back to delegating more power to Congress, which is impossible because once the Supreme Court has delegated that power to the president, you can't go back. It's a one-way street. Or they're just going to feel like it's too authoritarian or too bad or whatever to actually use those presidential powers in the way that they should. And that they're just going to not use them basically. And they're going to abdicate their power in that regard. And so, and to me, that would be my take, right? If I had to bet money on how the Democrats would react to this kind of end game continued consolidation of presidential power scenario, that's exactly what would happen, right? Every time a Republican got into power, they would do a whole bunch of disgusting things, right? Because they would understand game theory, they understand how to pull the levers of power, and then a Democrat would come in and be like, "Oh, actually, I don't recognize this lever of power. This lever of power, I'm going to pretend like it doesn't exist, and I'm going to go back to these old levers of power, even though the electricity has been cut from those old levers of power and they're useless." I wonder if that kind of deep analysis is going on behind the scenes on the part of the Republicans, and that is the ultimate reason why they want to push for as much presidential authority as possible, or the consolidation of presidential power, is because they are able to take advantage of it much more than the Democrats. In his chapter in the Blueprint, Vaught made clear he wanted the president and OMB to wield more direct power. Quote, "The director must view his job as the best, most comprehensive approximation of the president's mind," he wrote. Vaught described OMB as, quote, "a president's air traffic control system, which should be involved in all aspects of the White House policy process, becoming powerful enough to override implementing agencies/bureaucracies." Yeah, they're literally saying we want to be able to undermine other parts of the government. We want to be able to undermine other parts of government for our own cynical, purposes, our own ideological goals. Senator Mike Lee of Utah said on Fox News Channel that Vaught, quote, "has a plan, and that plan is going to succeed in further empowering Trump. This is going to be the Democrats' worst nightmare," end quote. House Speaker Mike Johnson echoed that message, insisting the government shutdown gives Trump and his budget director vast power over the federal government and the unilateral power to determine which personnel and policies are essential and which are not. Yeah, this is sort of a way that they can go around a whole bunch of the other rules that they are kind of sort of subject to adhering to, right? Like the one regarding the classification of employees, right? There's different classifications of federal employees, right? There's Class C, Class B, Class A, or whatever. And only certain ones are subject to political appointees, right? The president has the power to appoint the head of the official tippy top head of many of these agencies and some of the subsequent other more important heads of these agencies. But in general, in theory, he doesn't have the power to just fire career bureaucrats, subject matter experts that work in the agency. But that's something that's one of the key parts of Project 2025 was they wanted to reclassify whole swaths of the federal workforce so that they can fire and hire them based on political leanings, right? And so if we take the EPA, for instance, They want to be able to implement some sort of policy or some sort of test that says like, all right, we're going to give everybody who works at the EPA this test. And one of the questions could be, do you believe in man-made climate change? And we basically are going to say, look, anybody who answers no to that, or anybody who answers yes to that, we're just going to fire them and then rehire them with somebody who will answer no to that question. And so this is just sort of a loophole-y way they can go around many of these protections. Schumer has handed the keys of the kingdom to the president, Johnson said Thursday. Because they have decided to vote to shut the government down, they have now effectively turned off the legislative branch, and they've turned it over to the executive. See, this puts the Democrats in this is like a really good strategy from the Republicans, right? Like if I'm going to think about it from a game theory perspective, and it puts the Democrats in a really, really tough spot, right? Because the Democrats right now are sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't, right? They're damned if they sign off on this budget, then they're basically okaying this administration's unilateral control over the purse, right? It's basically it gives the green light for the tariffs that he's doing for impounding and withholding various types of funding for federal agencies that have already been appropriated by Congress. But if the Democrats don't vote for it and they continue to hold firm on this, which in theory is the correct political move, then the Republicans can cynically use this loophole to gut the federal government in a way and to a scale that the Democrats could, in any other scenario would be impossible and would really hurt the Democrats or hurt them with regards to their ideological goals. So yeah, I don't know. This is a really tough spot for the Democrats. I would say, if the Democrats knew for a fact that the administration was going to do this as soon as the government shutdown happened, and that they were going to fire millions of federal workers and basically destroy various federal agencies, then maybe I would be in favor of the Democrats voting for this budget resolution, despite its ACA subsidy rescissions. To ensure that kind of thing doesn't happen, right? But then if you do that, you're kind of capitulating to the power plays of the Republicans, and the only lesson it will teach them is that they can continue to keep doing that kind of thing for basically any issue and whatever they want, and the Democrats will bend the knee because they know their finger is over the nuke button, and they're like, oh, if you do it, if you shut down the government, we're gonna nuke. And the Democrats are like, well, we don't want to nuke. Losing the healthcare package is a bad thing, but nuking is even worse. And so it's they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. Dems are in a really weird spot for this. Young said the Constitution gives the White House no such power and chastised Republicans in Congress for abandoning their duty to serve as a check on the president. In theory, you would think Congress would want to retain their power, right? In theory, you would think most of these people are narcissists, right? You would think most of these people who spent their lives building up to this point of being a congressperson or whatever wouldn't want to abdicate their power to the buffoon in the presidency. But I think the Republican Party and the conservative movement is just so beholden to Trump at this point that any Republicans that maybe would want to push back against this know that it's political suicide for them. And so they're like, all right, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and let them do whatever they want, even if it takes away some of my power as a member of Congress. I don't want to hear a lecture about handing the keys over, she said. The keys are gone. They're lost. They're down a drain. This shutdown is not what lost the keys. Yeah, I would think the best strategy has to be just holding firm on this, right? Because as soon as you capitulate because you're worried about what the Trump administration is going to do regarding their weird loophole and firing of furloughed workers, right? As soon as you capitulate on that, you have capitulated on everything, and they can continue to repeat the strategy as many times as they want with whatever issues they want. But yeah, this seems to align with what I heard about this, right? That the Republicans really did want the government shut down so they could cynically implement their Project 2025 plan of gutting many of these federal agencies and potentially doing so in a politically motivated manner, right? They're wanting to gut agencies the Democrats like more. They're cutting appropriated funding, legally Congress appropriated funding from blue states or whatever. And yeah, this was all planned from the start. This was, the The Republicans are in a great spot with this because they're like, oh, if they pass our budget resolution, we're happy because we get the ACA subsidy rescissions actually like written into stone. And if they shut down the government and don't sign onto our budget resolution, then we can continue to then we can gut these federal agencies in a way that we were hoping we otherwise may not have been able to. And yeah, the Democrats are in a really weird spot. And I think, unfortunately, their only logical play moving forward from a strategy perspective is to continue to hold firm on the shutdown. And because as soon as you capitulate on this, with them, as soon as you capitulate because of their threats of what they're going to do to the federal workforce, you have lost all strategic standing. And so, yeah, this is genius strategy from the Republicans for terrible ideological reasons, and it puts the Democrats in a really, really tough spot. I'm fascinated to see how this will turn out. My gut tells me that enough Democrats after a couple of weeks are going to bend the knee and they're going to get their budget resolution passed. And honestly, it might be the worst of both worlds, right? It might be 2 or 3 weeks of performative resistance from some of these Democrats who are eventually going to cave. And in that time period, the Trump administration very well could implement many of these firings that they're threatening to do for the government shutdown. So in the way I could totally imagine, and in fact, this might actually very likely be the case, it's going to be the worst of both worlds, right? They're going to shut down the government just long enough that it gives the Republicans in this administration enough time to do their loopholey illegal cuts or whatever to these government agencies. And eventually they're going to get the budget resolution they want passed because the Democrats are going to cave. So I don't think the Democrat Party is equipped for this type of game theory type metagame strategizing for the Republicans. They're getting left in the dust. They're stuck in mud.